move individual subtools or subtools as a whole. In that case, we'll press either the W, E, or R key, and that brings up the gizmo you see here. And that should be relatively straightforward compared to any other transpose or gizmo that you've seen in other 3D applications. Currently, I'm going to untick that stack of boxes there. Your gizmo should look like this. If I click and drag in any of these axes, it will move that selected subtool. So I'm moving the body separate from the floor plane, the teeth, and the tongue. If I click and drag in this outer circle, I'll rotate around the visible axis. And if I click and drag in these circles here, I'll rotate around the X, Y, and Z axis. If I hold down the Shift key while I rotate, it will give me a little readout just down there. You see it next to the arm. That tells me the number of degrees that are being rotated. Now, if I want to move the pivot, hold down the Alt key and just click and drag in any of those white corners, and you can move that pivot. Now, let's say I want to move all the subtools, not just the currently selected subtool. That can be accomplished as well. Simply clicking this button here creates what's called the pizza box stack. This tells us that we are moving all the selected subtools. So now if I click and drag, you see everything is moving. The same goes for rotate and for scale. Now if I Control-Shift-Click on anything here in the view in terms of the subtools, I can remove or add elements to that transpose group. So Control-Shift-Click on the body, the teeth, and the tongue. You see the floor plane is no longer part of the transpose group, so I'm not moving the floor plane, I'm only moving the character and his teeth and tongue. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like this where, let's say for example, your gizmo is not actually sitting in the correct position, looking down each axis, unlock it by clicking the unlock button, reset it by clicking the reset button, and then turn off your X symmetry, and then hit this button here. Go to Unmasked Mesh Center. Oops. And that will recenter that gizmo right on the correct axis. Now lock it again, and you're able to use it for moving, scaling, and rotation. Now there's also an ability to pin the pivot here. So if you turn on sticky mode, that will be sticky. So if I try and move the pivot, it snaps back to its original location. And then there's the gear here, which allows us to access the primitives and deformers. We talk about the primitives and deformers in a separate video on transpose primitives and deformers. So in this video, we're mainly focusing on transpose posing. So now we've seen how we use the transpose gizmo to move, scale, and rotate individual subtools or groups of subtools. Now let's take a look at the transpose line, which is the other method of moving subtools in Zbrush. The transpose line actually predates the gizmo by several Zbrush versions, and we access it just by turning off the gizmo button here. Now if I click and drag, you see I've got this orange line with 3 orange circles. This is the transpose line. The transpose line is another method of moving and scaling and rotating subtools. So if I were to go to Move, click inside this center orange circle, I can move this subtool. If I wanted to scale it, I would click and drag to create a new transpose line. Go to E for scale and click inside the outermost circle and drag, and I will rotate or scale around this pivot here, which is the first circle. If I go to rotate, again, this will be my center of rotation. Click and drag in this outermost circle and it will rotate the character. Now, if I want to move, press the W key, click inside the center circle, and that moves. Now, we're only moving an individual subtool. We're not moving them all. To move all the subtools, we have to go to Z plugin and use Transpose Master. Now, this is a plugin we'll be talking about shortly. So transpose can be a little bit tricky because oftentimes you'll end up with something like this where your line is sort of stacked up in a way you can't see. So I just always draw a new line every time I want to use it just by clicking somewhere on the model, dragging off onto the background, so that creates a straight line. And then I click on any of the circles and I can move the transpose line and place it exactly where I want it. If I click on this circle, I can move this, and I can position that transpose line so it lays exactly where I want it to be. So let's check this with the tongue subtool. If I select the tongue subtool, we'll solo it, and I'll focus in on it. Now, if I click here and drag, I'm creating a new transpose line. If I go to R for rotate, clicking the outermost circle, I can rotate around this pivot here. Go to E for scale, I can scale around that pivot. Now watch this. If I take my transpose line, click on the outermost circle and just stretch it down and move it so it's running sort of along the axis, the center line of this tongue. And I go to R for rotate. Usually when we rotate, we use the outermost circle. But I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I am going to click and drag inside the center circle. And this will twist that object along its z-axis. Look at that. So we get a nice sort of twist to the tongue there. If I want to go to move, instead of clicking in the center circle, I'll click in the outer circle. I can skew and scale, or stretch, I should say, this object. And if I want to change the position of my tool, or my gizmo line, transpose line, click on a circle to move it. Click on a circle and to move it. Click on the center circle and you move the entire line. So that is transpose gizmo, or transpose line, to move individual subtools. It is separate from the gizmo. Again, you access it by turning the gizmo on and off. So if I'm in move mode here and I press the gizmo line button again, I get the gizmo back. If I turn it off, I get my transpose line. Now, a good tip, whenever I'm using transpose, I just always draw a new transpose line every time I want to use it. So let's take a look now at probably the most important aspect of transpose, and that is posing. We can use the transpose line to pose our characters and give them character and posture and make them interact with their environments and each other. So let's take a look now at how to do that. Now let's take a look at posing. For this creature, I'm going to start posing the character using the transpose line. So I'm going to select the body and I'm going to step down to the lowest subdivision level. I'm going to press W for move and then turn off the gizmo so I'm on the transpose line. Now, the transpose line generally moves the entire object. However, if you mask part of it, and I'm going to mask the torso by holding down the control key, clicking and dragging, and this does something called transpose masking. It masks based on the underlying topology. I'm just going to mask down to the waist here. Again, that's just hold down the control key and click and drag along the model. And you see as I drag out that transpose line, the model is masked based on the underlying topology. I'll go back into draw mode, hold down the control key. Let's turn off the floor plane so we can see better. And then I can just manually add into the mask using control click and drag. Now I'll control click on the background to invert that mask, and then control click on the mask itself to feather the edge. Now I'll go to R for rotate, and I'll click about here at the pelvis and drag a new transpose line out. I'm going to go to the top view and turn off perspective mode, and I'm just going to click and drag on the center circle and move that transpose line down the center of the spine and just turn off X symmetry. Now if I go to rotate, R for rotate, and then click in the outermost circle and drag, you see I'm moving the unmasked portion of the mesh. And if I move the transpose line, I can change that center of rotation. It will always be around the opposite circle. You may also notice that the teeth and the tongue are not moving. That's because those are subtools. To move those, we have to use Transpose Master. It's a plugin that's found in the Z plugin menu that will put all the subtools together into one temporary mesh, which can be posed together, and then it'll transfer that pose back to the individual subtools. To do that, we go to Z plugin, open Transpose Master, and here we have these two buttons. We're going to click the T-Pose Mesh button. T-Pose Mesh will take each subtool, drop it to its lowest subdivision level, and then merge them together in a temporary posing file. Now this mesh is not going to stick around. We're just going to use this to pose. When we're finished, we'll press T-pose to sub-T, and that's the button that executes the transpose master to copy those positions over to the other subtools. So W for move, control click and drag to mask based on topology down to the waist, control click to invert the mask, and then control click on the mask itself to feather it. A little bit better. Let's turn on X symmetry again while we're masking. There we go. Control click to invert the mask, and let's paint out some of the mask there on the back, and then control click on the mask itself to feather the edge. Go to rotate, click and drag to draw a new transpose line. Let's position that transpose line down the center of the model. Turn off X symmetry, and then I'm going to click and drag, and that rotates the torso up. Click and drag inside that center circle, and we can do a little bit of rotation on the body down the longitudinal axis of the torso. So let's go ahead and add some more to our mask here. I'm going to paint out the abdomen because I want the rest of this rotation to be centered mainly on the rib cage. Go to R for rotate. Let's click and drag to drag a new transpose line. Move it down the center line of the body. And then just click inside that center circle to get a nice rotation on the torso. Clear the mask. Now, anytime you start posing a character, you really will have to do a fair bit of resculpting because it's going to change the anatomy. It's going to change the underlying shapes. I'm going to turn down the Z intensity on my smooth brush and just do a little bit of shifting of the tummy here. And scooch things around as I go. Take the inflate brush, do a little bit of a compression here. We don't have to get too fancy with our resculpting while we're in Transpose Master, but I do find it helpful to just work into any sort of deformations or tweak things as necessary while I'm posing. Because again, you're going to find as you pose a character, muscles will elongate, fat will compress, the shapes need to change along with the pose. I'm going to go back to transpose line. I'm going to hold down the control key and click and drag down to the arm here. And I just want to mask out everything but this arm. And I'm just going to have to go in here manually and do a little bit of masking. I just want to isolate these shapes. I'm going to come in here and hold down the control key, just do a little bit of direct masking, control click to feather the edge of that mask. Now I'm going to go to the transpose line, draw a new transpose line from the shoulder out. I'm going to move it so the center of the rotation is sitting about where the rotation of the shoulder would actually be. And then we're going to click and drag to rotate the arm. Go to W for move, or excuse me, go to the move brush, I mean to say, B for brush, M for move, V hotkey, or use your brush hotkeys that you've set up. If you followed the hotkey video, you should have brush hotkeys already set for the move brush. And I'm just going to smooth that armpit out and then bring that geometry back up in there, just correcting the deformation in that area. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Let's mask down to this arm. Take the control key and paint the mask up in here. Feather it. Go to transpose, rotate, draw a new transpose line, and then we can rotate that arm out. Now I want to rotate this arm out around its longitudinal axis. So I'm going to place this transpose line going straight sort of down the humerus. Go to rotate, and remember, pull this outermost circle as far away from the body as possible. Then go to R for rotate, hold the Alt key down, and then click and drag. And you see what that does is that rotates that arm. Let's mask down to the forearm. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll start from the pointy out bit of the elbow, the olecranon process. Drag that out. Go to R for rotate. Hold down the Alt key. and then we can pronate and supinate that forearm. Now let's zoom into the hand here. I'm going to go ahead and isolate the hand just by using my visibility marquee. And let's isolate, let's say, the pinky finger. I want to adjust these fingers now so they're not splayed out as if he's pressing them down onto the ground. Now this is very interesting. I could bend this finger by starting my point of rotation here and dragging my transpose line up to the tip of the finger and then clicking in the outermost circle. But you see the compression that it makes at the joint there isn't really that good. So what I'll do is I'm going to use something called bone posing, which is available only with the transpose line. Go to R for rotate, but I draw my line and leave the last circle at the point of rotation that I want to manipulate. I'm just going to make sure that this is all unmasked. Go back to rotate. Now, if I hold down the Alt key and click in the outermost circle, it has a built-in skinning algorithm, so it stretches what's on the opposite side and compresses what's on the bending side. So let's do that again here at this first knuckle. Hold down the Alt key, click and drag. And you see this is fantastic for posing fingers. We'll do that again. Let's mask down to this ring finger. Manually paint out the mask where necessary. R for rotate. Let's draw our transpose line, ending it at the root of the finger. And I like to move that line so the center of rotation is right there in the center of the joint. Hold down the Alt key and then just bend that finger. And I'll take the move, W for move, and just gently scooch that down a little bit. And then let's do it again. Let's bring the circle here, go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key, and we'll get a nice bend there. Let's actually bend that finger out a little bit there. Place that circle right there in the center of the joint. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Repeating on the middle finger. R for rotate. Begin by doing the root of the finger here. Go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key. We'll bend that down. Drag that circle out to the center of the first joint, and then bend that there. Now I'm just going to come in here with my move brush and just scooch these faces at the roots of the fingers back and inflate them a little bit just to make sure that we don't lose volume here in the hand. There we go. And I'm just going to do a slight rotation. I kind of like the posture of these fingers. I just want to make that pointer finger straight out a little bit more than it already is. So let's go ahead and do a manual mask here. Control, click, and drag on the background just to do a masking marquee. R for rotate, and let's draw that transpose line there. Let's position the circle at the center of the rotation. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Bring the last one here, and there we go. Clear our mask, and now you can see we have posed that first hand. Now let's do the same thing for the other hand. I want to supinate this forearm as well. So I'm going to mask down to the forearm, draw my transpose line. Basically, when you're trying to do the forearm, it's best to do the transpose line just straight down the ulna. Right there, starting at the olecranon process, the elbow, essentially. Bringing that off. Go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key, and then click and drag. I just want to do a slight rotation to that hand, or that forearm. And now we'll isolate this hand and repeat that process on these fingers. So I'll mask down to this finger. Make sure my center of rotation is at the root of the finger. Go to R for rotate, Alt, click, and drag. That'll bend that finger down. Now we'll do the same thing for the ring finger. Again, you always want to make sure that you've got everything around it masked, because sometimes it can not quite be as opaque as you think it is, that being the mask. So you just want to make sure that you go in there and get those things properly masked out. Let's get that joint and then this joint. And go to the top view, and I just want to straighten that out a bit. Mask down to the middle finger. Once again, just making sure that everything is properly masked. Move that center down inside the center of the finger itself, or the finger joint. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Extend that down to the first finger, or the first knuckle, and bend. Holding down the Alt key as I do. Mask down to the index finger and just manually make sure that we get the rest of the masking in place. Draw a transpose line. Draw a transpose line. Move the transpose line, I mean to say. And let's straighten out that finger. R for rotate. Hold down the Alt key. And hold down the Alt key. And hold down the Alt key. Oops. Let's make sure that we extend our mask to this knuckle. And then hold down the Alt key while we're in rotate. And there we go. And let's do the same for these fingertips here. I'm going to mask this fingertip. Invert that mask. Go to my transpose line. Hold down the Alt key and rotate. Now I'm going to mask out the pinky finger and the carpal, or metacarpal, associated with it. I'm going to unmask it by control clicking on the background. I'm going to draw a transpose line here, go to rotate, and I'm going to click inside that center circle, because sometimes you get this nice sort of the pinky finger metacarpal does sort of curve in, so I just want to get that shape there. And then I'm going to rebend that finger. Let's extend the mask. Hold down the Alt key. And I want to get one more bend here at the tip. R for rotate, and let's get that tip. There we go. This fingertip's gone a little funky, so I'm just going to mask it. Invert the mask. Go to R for rotate and just click inside that center circle to fix that rotation, and then take the move brush and do any sort of tweaks that need to be done. And there we go. So let's do some posing on the head. So far we've just posed things that require just a single subtool to be manipulated, but we haven't done anything that requires multiple subtools. Let's change the head, including the teeth and the gums. So I'm going to go back to my transpose line. I'm going to transpose mask up to the neck. Now you see that that automatically masks the tongue and the teeth. So I'm going to unmask those by Control Alt, clicking and dragging a marquee around those so they are unmasked. Let's draw a transpose line that runs up the length of the spine, right here. Let's move that transpose line so it's sitting inside the head. And let's move the neck up. So I'm going to rotate by clicking here. Make sure that we're in R for rotate. Rotate that head up. And then click inside the center circle. And we can rotate the neck around its longitude. Now let's mask up to the base of the skull. We're going to have to manually correct any problem areas in the masking here. Manually unmask the teeth and the gum and the tongue. If I Control Shift click on these subtools, I can easily see and isolate them. Let's draw a new transpose line going from the base of the skull forward. Scooch that so it's sitting inside the head. And now, if I click inside the center circle and drag, I can rotate the head around that axis. Or if I click the outermost circle, I can move the head around. So if we're posing for about here, let's do this. Let's make that the pose. There we go. So now I want to see how this looks on the final figure. I'll go to Z plugin, and originally we pressed T-pose mesh. Now I'm going to press T-pose to subtool, and that takes the transpose mesh position and transfers it over to all the individual subtools on our original mesh. So we'll do that now, pressing T-pose to sub-T, and you see each individual subtool snaps into its new position. And I can step back up my subdivision levels in the body, and you can see all of my detail and all of my sculpting follow suit. Let's turn our floor plane back on. There we go. So now we've got a pose on that character that was originally just in a neutral position on all fours. We're able to rear him up and pose him not only the individual fingers and the mesh of the body, but we can also pose subtools together as long as we make sure that they are part of the unmasked group of faces. So transpose essentially will manipulate unmasked groups of faces when you're posing, and just remember that you need to be aware of the type of bend that you want to perform. If I want to bend a finger, I'll use bone posing. That is the Alt, click, and drag in the outermost circle. If I want to bend at the waist, for example, I'll do what I did before, which was just a standard, use the transpose rotate line, and I will just click and drag in the outermost circle on rotate, and it will perform exactly as I expect it to. So that's just very important to remember, that you do have multiple ways of accomplishing your pose. Transpose has a couple of sort of hidden functions that we just looked at. So just remember that those are there, and you should be just fine. Also remember that you will always need to come back in and do some re-sculpting once you've posed something. So I'll step down my subdivision levels, going with my clay tubes brush, and I'll just try and correct any sort of deformed or strange areas. I'll often smooth from the lower subdivision level and then step back up, and that helps soften out some of the deformations. And I just want to be really aware of how the muscles and bones are interacting and changing shape over the course of this pose, and then follow suit. So here I've got some compression and some problems in the spines here, so I'll just take the inflate brush and sort of inflate those up again. Do the same thing on this side. Take the move brush and just bring my points back into that. I'll come over here where the leg is compressing against the lateral oblique, and then I'll take my inflate brush. I'm just going to mask out the thigh right here, and I'll just inflate up against it and take the move brush and tuck that down, invert that mask and tuck that against it. And then once I have those two shapes relatively close together, then I'll take the inflate brush and run the inflate brush along that crease like this. That just helps give me a little bit more of a sense of compressing flesh there. And there we go. So now that we've seen how to pose using transpose, I want to point out another option that we have when we're working with Transpose Master, and that is posing with Z-sphere rigs. Now, we briefly talked about Z-sphere rigging in the Z-sphere chapter, but we want to revisit it now because I think it's very, very important to understand that you can use Z-sphere rigs to pose a complex character such as this. So I'm going to initialize ZBrush. There we go. So now we're back to our original mesh. Now I'm going to go to my subtool menu, turn off the floor plane, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before by going to Z plugin and Transpose Master, but I'm going to turn on Z Sphere Rig and then press T-pose mesh. Now what that is going to do, it's going to automatically set up the model for Z Sphere rigging. So I'm going to go to W for move, turn my draw size down to 0, and I'm going to move that root Z-sphere into the center of the model. Just like so. That's going to be my root Z-sphere. Actually, I want to move it up to about the torso, about the chest here. Then I'm going to go back into draw mode and turn on solo and make sure my X symmetry is turned on. I'm going to draw a child sphere right here. Press shift to snap it to the same size and double click off the model. And do the same thing here. Draw a child sphere, double click off the model, turn off solo. I'm going to go to W for move and bring this down to the waist and bring this up to the shoulders. Now, if you don't know how to draw Z-spheres yet, go ahead and watch the Z-sphere chapter. you really do need to have seen that to really follow what I'm doing here. Basically, we're just drawing a chain of z-spheres which allow us to create a skeleton. Now, typically we use z-spheres to generate meshes, but we're not doing that here. For the knee, I often, instead of making a single sphere for the knee, I do two spheres, like this. Drag this sphere down. And that's how I structure the knee. And let's draw a child sphere here. W for move, and bring that down to the ankle. Draw a child sphere here. And then bring that down into the foot. I'm not worried about posing the toes, so I'm just going to let that sphere carry all the vertices of the toes. Each z-sphere that we draw is basically going to capture vertices in the rig. So it's going to capture verts and influence verts in the rig. So if I want to move the hips up, I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click in between those two spheres, the root or the hips and the pelvis and the hips, and I can move that as a group. I want to draw a child sphere for the tail, so let's draw a child sphere here, snap it to the same size, and we're just going to move it and scale it down a little bit. Move it. Turn off solo so we can see. Let's bring it to about here, and I'm going to go to Q for draw, and I'm going to add a couple child spheres through here. Let's scale this one down, scale this one down, move it inside the tail. Let's scale this one down, move it inside the tail, and let's draw another child sphere here. Go to W for move, and we'll just bring this up to here, and draw two more child spheres along the length of that, and move those into position. And then we'll draw two child spheres on either side here. Let's go into solo mode so we can see this better. Draw two child spheres here, and then two more child spheres on top of that. And then I'll go to move, and I'll bring those little ones out here and scale them down. And then draw a couple child spheres along the length of that and move them inside the prongs of the tail. And make sure that those actually sit correctly from every view. Just like this. Perfect. So now let's come back up here to the torso, go into solo mode, and let's draw some shoulders here. I'm going to go to child spheres, draw two shoulders, draw two more child spheres, and let's move these out like so. Draw two more child spheres here, and let's bring these down to the elbows. Draw a child sphere here, and move that down to the wrist. Now, of course, I could put spheres all the way down inside each finger as well to have total control over the finger posing. Let's get back to that elbow, and let's scale that down. Move that back into the correct position, and like so. Draw a child sphere here, bring that down into the hand. Now we're going to draw our neck spheres. Let's draw a sphere for the neck and a child sphere. Move that child sphere up, move that neck sphere up just a bit, and there we go. Now I'm going to draw a child sphere on the front and on the back. This is to capture the head. Turn off solo, and then I will W for move that forward and that forward. And here we go. So now I'm ready to do my posing. So I'm going to go to rigging and click bind mesh. Now, if I go to R for rotate, turn off my X symmetry, click and drag, you see I'm actually posing the mesh as I work. Now this is best, I think, for doing things like the tail. I can move the tail off center and really curl it as you would, sort of as you would expect to see a tail like this um, manipulated. So if I hold down the Alt key, click in between these two, there we go. There we go. Click and rotate on this sphere here to add a little bit of twist to the tail. Bring that down. Let's put a little bit more here. We can move this leg back. Move this leg forward. There we go. And then if we come down here to the waist, let's solo again so we can actually see our rig. If we click this, here we go, let's click this one here. Let's give that a bit of a rotation. Turn off solo so we can see our mesh again. There we go. So you can see we can actually rotate the entire torso. It's a very, very effective way of posing. There we go. Now once we're happy with it, let's zoom out and just take a good look at it here. So that seems a nice pose. We've actually done quite a bit of manipulation. And you see it's a totally different type of posing than what you might expect to see, say, if you were doing your transpose line, where you're sort of working your way down the limbs, posing bit by bit. This is much more akin to posing with a skeleton in a rigging situation, because it's essentially what's happening. Each one of those Z-spheres is capturing the vertices that are closest to it. So if you do find an area that's not deforming accurately, just go in and add more Z-spheres to that area, and then it'll capture vertices and lock them into the region that you want them to be in. For example, in the torso here, if I'm not getting enough deformation here, I can always add another Z-sphere and maybe extend a couple of ribs, so to speak, coming out, so it will grab these vertices and keep them locked into the shape of the torso as it moves. So now we have rigged this character using our Z-sphere chain. This is where it gets fun. Go to Z plugin and remember where we press T-pose to sub-T. If I press this again, it's going to pick up the pose from my Z-sphere rig and then apply it to my original character. And here we go. It has transposed the pose over. You can see we've got that lovely curvature of the tail, positioning of the arms and the limbs. All of that created just with the transpose rig. So hopefully you found this helpful. You can see now how we use the Gizmo to move subtools in relation to one another, how we use the transpose line to move objects in relation to one another, and most importantly, how we use the transpose line for posing, and how we use transpose master with Z-sphere rigs to also activate the posing capabilities inside of Zbrush. So hopefully you found this useful, and it's something that you can go forward now and use in your own pipeline. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.